First of all, I'd like to thank the museum for having me. It is an honor to be here to pay tribute to Viktor's life and his work, and also to have the opportunity to share for all of you a bit of what I experienced while I was in Ukraine. I didn't know Viktor, but after being asked to speak here tonight, I researched him and what he has done. And I found that his life represents, in a lot of ways, the three main lessons that I took from the Ukraine war. Viktor was 27 years old when he was killed in Lugansk, near Lugansk, while trying to transport wounded soldiers. He was killed more than a month after the ceasefire was signed in Minsk, which in theory put an end to the fighting. And because of this, I think his death represents one of the most fundamental truths that I discovered in Ukraine. It's a real war. Not skirmishes or battles or little gunfights. It's a war, the capital W. And it's still going on. The ceasefire was signed on September 5th, and there have been 1,000 soldiers and civilians killed since then. That's a third of the conflict's total casualties, averaging about 13 a day. And just this Tuesday, a bus carrying 13 civilians was hit by a rocket near Donetsk, killing 13. There's daily battles at the Donetsk airport, and Russia continues to send tanks, weapons, and soldiers into Ukraine, continuing the war and the bloodshed. When I first got to Ukraine, I have to admit I didn't know nearly enough about the country. I went there on somewhat of a last-minute decision. But I sensed that the world wasn't getting the truth about what was happening. And when I got there, I found out that I was right. My first impression of Ukraine was when I first got to Kyiv. I put my bags down at the Hotel Ukraine and went out and walked around the Maidan. And there were still bullet holes in the ground where snipers had shot down protesters. And there were still burn marks on the stone floor of the Maidan where protesters lit tires to provide smoke screens from the snipers who were gunning down civilians, men, women, young students, just out there protesting for their freedom. And while I was walking around, I heard an American voice, which stands out from the rest for me because I don't speak any Ukrainian. And I heard this young man say, "Freedom is not free." And as a former special operations pilot who's been to war as a pilot, but as a combatant, I had always heard that expression, that you fight for freedom. But my time in Ukraine was different than my time in Iraq and Afghanistan, because people in Ukraine were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for democracy, their future, their own country, their lives. And that was a very strong initial impression that also highlighted for me the seriousness of what was at stake for Ukraine. After my first few weeks in Kyiv, kind of getting my bearings and making some connections, I befriended a young man who's 22 years old named Valentin Onyshenko. He was a reserve lieutenant in the Ukrainian military, and he became my fixer. And together we went out to the east, and we went to Lugansk near Donetsk, and we also visited Slavyansk and a small town called Semyonovka. And just to reiterate my point that this is a real war, this is not a pitch for my website, but if you go on blueforcetracker.com, there are pictures of Semyonovka. And they could easily be pictures of Hiroshima. I mean, the town was leveled by artillery, flattened. Every vertical structure is peppered with shrapnel holes. It was insane. And it really gave me a sense of what had just gone on here. It wasn't, this is not an insignificant skirmish. It was real. And then several weeks later, so I spent some time in Semyonovka and did some interviews, talked to the soldiers. Went back to Kyiv, was doing some more stories, just doing mainly interviews. And I got word that Russia had initiated an invasion of southern Ukraine. And so I hopped on a train and went down to Mariupol. And while I was in Mariupol, the town was digging in for... It's okay. Yes, exactly. Cry away. The town was digging in for an invasion. I mean, I don't know if it was in 2014, a city in Europe was building trenches and putting up tank barriers, awaiting an invasion of, from sources in Novozovsk, which is, excuse my pronunciation, just up the coast from Mariupol, there were 67 Russian tanks in that city. 67 tanks. And daily, Russia lobs artillery into Ukraine. Russian fighter jets from Russia patrol the airspace and have shot at Ukrainian airplanes. I mean, it's a real war. And I think the world needs to know that. Which brings me to my second lesson that I learned in Ukraine. The world doesn't know the truth. And it's so important for brave journalists like Viktor to tell the truth and to let the world know what's going on in Ukraine. And just as one little anecdote to make my point, when I was in Semyonovka, I walked around the streets and I walked up to this older woman, and Valentin is translating for me, of course. And I asked her, I said, who's responsible for the damage? Who destroyed your home? She was out there cleaning up the remnants of her home. And she said, well, the rebels. They fled in here and they destroyed the area before they moved off. And I was shocked. One block down the road, there was a family out clearing the rubble from what used to be their home. I asked them the same question. I said, who destroyed your village? They said the American CIA bombers did. And they had been there for the battle. But their opinion was based on Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda is powerful enough to make people disbelieve their own eyeballs. That's what we're up against in Ukraine. And that's why it's so important that people are out there telling the truth about what they see and letting the rest of the world know. And the third lesson that I like to share is that while Viktor's life was remarkable, it wasn't necessarily unique in Ukraine right now. There's a generation of Ukrainians who have put aside their own desires for their futures, their own well-being, their own dreams, to fight for their freedom. Viktor was one of them. And I had the opportunity to meet quite a few while I was in Ukraine. Oksana Shornaya, excuse my pronunciation, she's 34 years old, college professor. Her dream was to travel the world. And when the fighting kicked off, she saw some of her friends on Facebook who were in the military holding the line around Donetsk. And they said they didn't have sleeping bags, they don't have blankets, they don't have helmets. They buy their uniforms off of the internet. They have nothing, no food. They were starving. And so she went on Facebook and started a campaign to raise money to buy what these soldiers needed. And this 34-year-old woman with absolutely zero military experience was putting this equipment into vans and transporting it on her own back and forth to the front line, being shelled at, and she was driving all the way up to the soldiers holding the lines in the midst of the battles. I didn't even want to go there. It was too scary. And she was doing this once a week. And there were also reports that some of these people transporting supplies, like Oksana, were disappearing. It's speculation, but there are rumors that there are FSB hit squads out there stopping people from transporting supplies to the front lines. That's the kind of bravery I saw in Ukraine. There was Leonid and Natalie Oksenichenko and their 3-year-old daughter Veronica, who I met in Mariupol. Leonid had a business in Mariupol, and as the town was preparing for an invasion and a street fight, Leonid and Natalie had an impossible choice. Do we leave and become refugees and basically live in tents in some field somewhere? Or do we stay here and risk our daughter being killed in street-to-street fighting? Nobody knew what was going to happen in Mariupol. It looked like it could be, Stalingrad's an extreme example, but it looked like it could have been something like that. People were turning their basements into bomb shelters. Mass exodus of refugees from the city. It looked bad. And I got to know Leonid and Natalie, and we were there as the rebels, the separatists, and their Russian tanks began their attack on the city. And it looked for a moment like all was lost until the ceasefire was signed, and that battle did end in Mariupol, and the city was spared. But could you imagine being 32 years old, man or woman, with your child, and not knowing whether your home is going to be in the middle of a battle the next day? At night, you can hear the tanks shooting at each other, see the flashes in the sky. And then there's Valentin, who I mentioned earlier, my fixer. 22 years old. He's a reserve lieutenant in the Ukrainian army. He was on the Maidan. And when I got to know him and we were driving out to Donetsk, had some vodka one night, and he told me some of his stories. He's 22 years old. He was on the Maidan, and a sniper's bullet hit him in the belt buckle, knocked him off a barricade he was standing on. And he popped up. Everybody thought he was dead, but he popped up and he was alive. Then he proceeded to start running away from the Berkut who were coming. And the man in front of him was shot in the head, and his brains flew all over Valentin's face and broke his reading glasses. He walked into a McDonald's and cleaned his face, and then went back out and kept on protesting. 22 years old. And as the days wore on at the Maidan, Valentin was instructed to take wounded protesters to hide them at a Greek Orthodox church, because the Berkut were patrolling the hospitals, and a lot of injured protesters disappeared at this time, and a lot were beaten with batons in their hospital beds by the Berkut. The Berkut, if you don't know, are the former, like the special police. And so Valentin took these wounded protesters to hide them at a Greek Orthodox church in the basement. And in the middle of the night, there was a knock at the front door, and it was the Berkut. And so they were all hiding in the basement, knowing that they could potentially, at that point, they thought they were all going to be killed. And the priest held it together and convinced this squad of Berkut thugs that there was nobody there, and they went away. So anyway, that was Valentin's story, and as a 22-year-old man, he's been through a lot, but I think his story is very indicative of the stories of a lot of Ukrainians. And when going back to my first day in Ukraine, my friend Mike, who was an Air Force major and F-16 pilot who's living in Lviv to study, he went and met me in Kyiv, and he walked me around. And I was walking through the Maidan, and there was a rally going on. And the speaker kept on saying a phrase, and the crowd would say something back. And I asked Mike, I was like, what is he saying? So the speaker is saying, "Glory to Ukraine." And the crowd is repeating back, "Glory to heroes." Well, after my time in Ukraine, I now have faces to put to that word, heroes. And I think thanks to this exhibit, hopefully a lot of Americans will be able to add Viktor's name and face to their idea of the heroes who are fighting in Ukraine for their freedom. Thank you.